As the NATO summit wraps up, what is the real consensus on Ukraine? Meeting in Vilnius, members stopped far short of inviting Kiev to join the military alliance. With Ukraine's president clearly frustrated, it seems NATO is only intent on maintaining the status quo for now. I'm Andrij Dobriansky, and today's newsmaker is NATO.
We will not waver. We will not waver. I mean that. Our commitment to Ukraine will not weaken. We will stand for liberty and freedom today, tomorrow, and for as long as it takes.
Well, that's how U.S. President Joe Biden ended this week's NATO summit in Lithuania. It was a vow of unwavering support for Ukraine and a promise of the military alliance's unity in the face of Russian aggression. But this wasn't the outcome Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky had been hoping for. He joined leaders of the world's most powerful military bloc for the two-day event, but ahead of the summit, he argued his nation needed NATO membership.
It is unprecedented and absurd when a time frame is not set, neither for the invitation nor for Ukraine's membership.
Well, NATO members said that Ukraine could not join the alliance in the midst of a war, but that it could once the fighting is resolved. The stance highlighted the divisions among its 31 members over giving neither a date nor a straightforward invitation for Ukraine to join. Well, the cracks really showed when UK Defense Secretary Ben Wallace said people wanted to see more gratitude from Ukraine for the weapons its Western allies have supplied. Wallace said, "We're not Amazon." It's a comment UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has since distanced himself from. Well, over the course of the summit, however, Zelensky changed his tune. At the final press conference, he called the summit positive, saying that it was clear that Ukraine will one day be in NATO. He also showed his appreciation to the United States.
Thank you so much for this help. You spend this money for our lives, and I think that we save the lives for Europe and for all the world.
So while Ukraine didn't get its NATO membership, Zelensky left with more than just pledges. France agreed to supply more long-range missiles to Ukraine, while Germany cleared a $769 million weapons package to assist the country.
It is about a security partnership which is urgently needed and which makes it possible for the state which signed it to further specify their contribution in the current situation, but also to embed it in a longer-term strategy that Ukraine can then rely on. It is already the case today that, with the support we are providing, we have put Ukraine in a position to defend its country much more strongly than would otherwise have been possible from its own economic performance.
Well, joining me now to discuss the NATO summit and Ukraine's position in it are from London, Paul Ingram, Senior Research Associate at Cambridge University's Center for the Study of Existential Risk. From New York, Andrij Dobriansky, he is the Communications Director for the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America. And from Moscow, we have Viktor Olevich. He is a lead expert at the Moscow-based think tank, the Center for Actual Politics. Thanks all so much for being with us. This summit seems like diplomacy at its best or its worst, I guess, depending on where you stand, because all sides were able to appear like they were coming off tough. You know, we had the UK saying they wanted to see some gratitude, for example, Ukraine standing its ground on, insisting on NATO membership prior. But the whole thing ended in just basically maintaining the status quo. Paul, is that fair?
To some extent. I mean, there were a lot of commitments to new weapon systems, which I think underscores the way in which many of the NATO states have chosen to take rather a simple, clear line, which may be understandable given the brutality of the Russian behavior, but at the same time closes the opportunities or possibilities for negotiation or reaching out to the Russians and raises the risks involved of escalation, which I think is a serious problem, but was not really very discussed in the NATO summit.
Fair enough. But also, to be fair, Andrei, I mean, we should remember that the G7 had promised a renewed commitment to eventual membership. Could that still be the promise that, but NATO just doesn't want it announced right now to avoid further provocation?
I find that to be absurd. It is a problem that an invitation wasn't extended. We are basically back where we were in 2008 when the communique talked about Ukraine's eventual membership. There's realistically not that much difference between now and then, other than a whole slew of countries were invited back then. I believe it was Albania and Croatia who were invited, were offered an invitation, and then the process began towards their ratification as members of NATO. This is not what happened this time. Just want to, slight correction. The G7 announced the JEDI group, the Joint European Defense Initiative, for people to give more weapons to Ukraine. But NATO, however, didn't give an invitation. Although we know at this point that over 2/3, 23 countries, have signed joint declarations with Ukraine, saying that they want Ukraine to be a member. So it is a smaller and smaller cadre of countries blocking this invitation coming to Ukraine.
So, Andrei, correct me if I'm wrong in my assessment here, but Paul seems to think NATO's stance at the end of this summit could actually further prolong the war by making pledges of more weapons, et cetera, as it has been. But you seem to think that because they didn't go even further, that's why the war will be prolonged, that invitation should have been extended.
Well, I'm firmly in the camp to believe that once a country is in NATO, then nobody touches that country. And that's what Ukraine was hoping for. That's what a lot of people were hoping for. But the realistic hope was the invitation, as you mentioned in your introduction. An invitation should have been extended, and then everybody would have been on the same page. The fact that Ukraine was talked about in 2008. Think about how long ago we're talking about. 2008. Ukraine was mentioned in the communique as a future member, and that's not even counting the fact that they've been involved in so many NATO operations. They were the third largest contingent in Iraq. They've always been on the side of Ukrainian deployment since 1996, the first country coming out of the Soviet Union to sign on for the Partnership for Peace program. This is a long-term partnership. And what we see when from the Ukraine side, when they're being invaded time and time again, by the larger neighbor, they are defending it quite admirably and honorably. But what we don't get is the rest of Europe acknowledging the fact that this country is on their level.
Okay, Paul, I can see you disagree, but first, let me just get Viktor's stance on the exchange, Viktor, that you just heard.
Look, it was quite obvious and predictable that Ukraine would not be joining NATO as long as the military conflict continues. If we look at the way NATO functions, any NATO member that can invoke essentially Article 5, calling for other NATO members to assist militarily if it deems that an attack from a non-NATO member is going on. In that case, other NATO members would have to immediately begin not just military weapons transfers, but direct military involvement on the side of Ukraine. That would lead immediately, I would repeat, immediately, to an initiation of hostilities between NATO members and Russia.
Right.
Russia is a nuclear state. NATO also has 3 nuclear states: France, Great Britain, and the United States. Nobody in NATO capitals wants a direct military conflict between Russia and NATO.
Fair enough.
Nobody in Washington or London or other NATO capitals wants a nuclear war or a specter of escalation between Russia and NATO.
Understood. But Viktor, let me ask you about this, because it's interesting when we think about the fact that Ukraine wants to join NATO, as it said, as soon as its land is safe. Okay, so they understand that there's going to have to be a resolution first, but still wanting to join NATO means, in effect, Ukraine is expecting very long-term problems with Russia. Is it not?
Well, most countries that have joined NATO before have not had any problems with Russia directly. So there are a number of reasons why various countries join NATO. But when we look at it from Russia's security perspective, Ukraine joining NATO at this point is simply it's a non-starter. Ukraine would have to recognize, for example, that Crimea is a part of Russia to join NATO, because otherwise NATO is simply not going to extend an invitation to Ukraine, because for the reasons that I mentioned before. As long as hostilities continue in Ukraine, and as long as Ukraine and its neighbor states, including Russia, as long as they do not recognize common borders, Ukraine is not going to get a direct invitation to join NATO. So this conflict requires a negotiated settlement. The negotiations may begin in a few months, or they may begin in a few years. There may be a parallel, which is it's quite probable that there may be a parallel political and military process, as we had seen during the Vietnam War, when the Paris negotiations continued for years as the war in Vietnam progressed.
Okay.
So before this is unfortunately not going to end anytime soon.
Okay. Andrij, I could see you disagree, but Paul, I want to get your thoughts first, because I know you had a comment earlier on. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I would agree with much of what's just been said there, and agreeing with that doesn't agree with the actions of Russia in Ukraine today. And I think there is a deep oversimplification of you're either with us or against us. And I think there is also a neglect of the dynamics involved here over time. We do need to condemn Russian behavior, but we also need to leave open the prospects for negotiation. We very quickly get drawn into sides, and when we get drawn into sides, we name call, as President Biden did yesterday, which doesn't help the situation and closes the possibility of negotiations.
Okay.
What we need to be doing is ensuring that we're not bringing in bad incentives. If we were to have offered NATO membership to Ukraine, there would have been very strong incentives for Russia to continue this conflict as long as it could, to ensure that Ukraine could never join NATO.
Okay, Paul, I'm going to stick with you for a minute, because we need to get to the comments specifically from the UK's defense minister. You mentioned what President Biden had said that you didn't quite agree with. But now the UK's defense minister had said that perhaps people want to see some gratitude. He didn't say Ukraine was necessarily ungrateful, but has Kiev somehow seemed ungrateful to the powers in the UK?
Well, I think that was a comment that was off beat, and I think it was rather UK centered. It came from a frustration with the level of commentary coming from President Zelensky in particular. And I think that, but I think Zelensky's comments have been understandable. Looking at it from Ukraine's perspective, they're in the middle of a war. They are losing a lot of people, and they have been dealt a hugely brutal situation. So there's no surprise that Ukraine's president and officials have been very assertive in their diplomacy. And I think that whilst sometimes that assertion has been overstepping the sensitivities of some of the NATO allies, I think for Ben Wallace to have said what he said, I think was deeply insensitive to Ukraine's position at the moment.
Fair enough.
And that's why I think the Prime Minister stepped back.
Okay. Andrij, I need you to help us here and to help us explain how this is working, whether Kiev is actually getting military aid for free, or are they paying for it? Is it based on credit that will have to come back in the future? Because it almost gives Ukraine's allies kind of this perverse incentive to maybe get the best of both worlds. Have Ukraine, as a NATO ally, but not an actual member, so that they can sell them weapons, but are not obligated to protect them via the NATO treaty?
Well, that's an interesting proposition. What we're seeing actually, though, is probably the largest disarmament program in the history of the world, with all of these stockpiles being reduced in all major countries around the world. Many of these stockpiles are antiquated systems, the Soviet systems that were being bought up by countries in NATO to take them off the hands of terrorists and put in the hands of Ukraine a lot of these S-200, S-300 systems that we did not want to see as the West falling into terrorist hands. This is exactly what Ukraine did when it gave the largest gift to peace to the world, when it voluntarily disarmed its nuclear arsenal and with the agreement of 1996. However, the proposition of saying that the West is interested in simply giving Ukraine money or selling arms to Ukraine is frankly not true, because again, the large allotment of weapons comes out of stockpiles. This is not money that's being handed over. This is not Iraq. This is not even the financial assistance to Ukraine doesn't happen in terms of pallets of cash. This is all done electronically. It's all monitored. Frankly, I haven't seen an international support project like this that is so vetted in terms of multiple inspector generals checking it out, both from the Ukraine side and from different countries' side. So I would reject that proposition, and the fact that
interesting, though, Andrei, because the Russians think very differently. They truly believe that the United States, for example, actually wants this war because their military-industrial complex is making huge amounts of money, able to sell weapons. You think none of that is true?
I believe that you cannot trust the Russian to his face. It is a bold-faced lie when they say they never invaded Crimea. It is a bold-faced lie when they say that they never shot down MH17.
I'm just asking about who's selling weapons, who's profiting from weapons, and you seem to think this is really only based on dwindling stockpiles and aid.
Who's profiting from weapons are the people in the countries that are manufacturing the weapons. This is a wonderful project for countries that are actually restarting their armaments of democracy, as we called it 70 years ago. And those are the people that are earning a good living and helping the rest of the world. That's who's actually getting the money. It's not large stockpiles of money to Ukrainians who are being bombed every day, including a 7-year-old child that was just killed yesterday.
Okay, I'll tell you what, I wanted to move on because if we look forward to, Viktor, I'll come to you, how NATO wants this conflict to end. And maybe the fact, as we know that 20% of Georgia's territory is actually occupied by Russia, might it mean some NATO members think, hey, we didn't disrupt the world order to actually protect our Georgian friends, so how much should we really do for Ukraine at this point?
Well, the question doesn't just deal with how much profit the military-industrial complex in the West is making from it, but from the strategic goals that Washington and some of its allies have made for this conflict. There are Americans, the British, the French are not losing people in this conflict. Russians and Ukrainians are losing people in this conflict. And the question is, does this conflict, from the point of view of Washington or London or some other NATO capitals, does this conflict make Russia weaker? And the answer from their perspective is yes. Washington does believe that this conflict is making Russia weaker, and at the same time, Washington, London, and other NATO capitals are not losing their own people. They're simply moving weapons and making financial transfers and providing Ukraine with diplomatic and media support. Is that a price that they're willing to pay for making Russia weaker for a long time? Probably yes. So yes, NATO does have an incentive to have this conflict continue for as long as possible, as long as those goals are met.
Some NATO members may have that incentive, but what about the others that do seem to want out?
Yes, some do. NATO, there are different opinions within NATO structures. It's a large organization with dozens of countries in it. And of course, this conflict will end sooner or later. there are possible solutions, possible negotiating positions that may be applied in this conflict to resolve it. One possible ending to this conflict would involve Ukraine, for example, recognizing that a part of the territory that it considers a part of its country, a part of Ukraine, being under the control of Russia for an extended period of time, and it may also involve Russia basically agreeing that a part of the territory that it designates as its own, and that is not under Russian control even right now, to be under Ukrainian control for some amount of time, or for a prolonged amount of time. Could that be a possible solution? Sure. Is it probable that these negotiations will lead to such a solution if the negotiations start anytime soon, that this will be a solution that is reached in the next few months? Probably not.
Okay.
Again, unfortunately, this conflict is probably going to last for a very long time.
And Andrij, I know you believe that no such compromises should be made. But let me come to Paul quickly, because when we talk about the divisions we've mentioned within NATO that are very diplomatically spoken of right now, we haven't really seen these head-to-head clashes, but we know that they're there. What about those members that say, should we at least try to push Ukraine to accept some compromises here for the sake of ending this war sooner rather than later? And Andrij, I know you don't think that there's any real push for that, but Paul, go ahead.
So I don't think there's any push for it at the moment. Certainly within the US and some of the leading NATO member states, there's a great deal of opposition to that. You can interpret it in the way that Viktor does. There are other reasons as well. I think, again, they're playing to domestic audiences. It seems to be much easier for politicians to demonize Russia than it is to negotiate with it. And I certainly don't think there's any appetite at all within Ukraine for compromise. There was early on in the conflict, and there were negotiations in Turkey that looked quite promising. But the people that were involved in those negotiations have no appetite to go back to some of those proposals. So negotiations look very poor at the moment, the prospects of negotiation. But we have to go there, because the only alternative is an ongoing conflict in which more Ukrainians die, more Russians die, and the risk of escalation continues to go up. Okay. And nobody wins in the end if we go up and up the escalation ladder. So more pressure is needed than has been seen up to now, and that requires a great deal more courage than we've seen up to now.
Andrij?
If you ask me in 2014, when this war began, what the eventual goal was from the Ukrainian side, and I had only one word then, and it's only one word now, and that's justice. When I was in Ukraine 3 weeks ago, I met a young woman on a train, and we discussed what her background was. She's a very soft-spoken woman. She ended up showing me a picture of her completely destroyed home in Mariupol. And that woman, for the rest of her life, is dedicated to hurting the people that hurt her and her family. So justice is what is needed here, not a negotiation of ceding territory, because the longer this goes on, the more at fear Russians should be that every single one of those officers who decided to break international law and kill innocent children and defile the Ukrainian homeland, they're going to be hunted down for the rest of their life. That's what the international community needed to do after a large conflict like World War I, World War II, is put norms in place, and that's not happening right now.
There may be a discussion over revenge versus justice here, but unfortunately we don't have time for that. I need to end it there. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for joining us on this edition of The Newsmakers. Unfortunately, we're actually over time, so I'll thank our viewers for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrij Dobriansky. We'll see you next time.